Hello and welcome to today's webcast brought to you by Compliance Week and IBM. I'm Katie Klockner with Compliance Week and I'll be your host. Today's webcast is Enable Governance and Value in the Information Economy. Before we hear from our presenters, let me review the agenda. We're scheduled to go for 1 hour. After the presentation, we will have a question and answer session. Your questions will be kept confidential and anonymous, so please don't be shy. You can ask your questions at any time using the Ask a Question function on the left-hand side of your screen, and I'll pose them to our guests at the end of their presentation. After the Q&A, I'll wrap up the webcast. This webcast will also offer CPE credit for all attendees. Please disable your pop-up blockers in order to access the exam. To obtain your CPE credit, wait until the webcast is completely over and I sign off. At that point, the final examination will be presented automatically in a separate window. If you have trouble viewing the CPE test or receiving the CPE certificate, please send an email to info@complianceweek.com. I'll repeat these instructions at the end of the webcast, so if you missed anything, stay tuned. A few other administrative details. At any time during the presentation, listeners can download the slides from the drop-down menu on the left-hand side of your screen. There you will also find the feedback form for the webcast. We welcome your thoughts as we are always looking to improve your experience. If you wish to increase the slide size, you can also hit the View Slide Full Screen button at the top right of your screen. And lastly, a help button is located in the upper right-hand corner of your screen for assistance. I'd like to welcome today's speakers. It is my pleasure to introduce Amir Jaibaji. Amir has over 15 years of experience owning product vision and direction. At IBM, he focuses on solving complex information governance problems and helping customers get started on their GDPR journey. We also have Candice McCabe with us. Candice is responsible for information risk, compliance, and privacy management at J.B. Hunt. She provides value by analyzing and understanding complex technical and business concepts while developing creative, effective, and value-driven solutions for privacy and governance. It's great to have you both with us. And with that, I will turn it over to Amir to get us started.
Thanks, Katie. And repeat the, thank you to the CGOC for sponsoring this as well as IBM. So today, quick agenda, is to go through, the value of information protection, cataloging, the what, the how, and the why. And I first off want to thank Candice for agreeing to join us today. I've known Candice for quite a while. Candice, welcome, and good to talk to you again.
Thanks, Amir. It's good to be here.
Hi, Candice. So let's actually start with a little definition time. I think let's set some baselines on what do you see as cataloging, data categorization, and data mapping?
So honestly, I consider these to be foundational to any program to define, to develop and to define your information value. In today's world, there's this whole conversation about what is information. It's the new bacon or it's the new oil. A recent reference I saw showed it as the new nuclear energy, and that was probably a better response than bacon or oil, even though I have to say I'm a keto dieter, so bacon's kind of in my wheelhouse. Nuclear energy is a more renewable source. Oil is a finite. Bacon, unfortunately, is a finite source, and information is not. It's a resource that we have where we can continually derive more value out of the data that we have. If we manage it well. And knowing what you have and where it is and how to get to it are essential to being able to do that, which is the whole point behind classifying and cataloging. So it's that concept of, if you don't know what you have, how can you protect it, or how can you utilize it? I saw this infographic that CGOC put together talking about the value of data and the fact that there is a cost, and you have to continually manage that risk to reward value map. And some of these were much more relevant and poignant to me personally. Cost for eDiscovery is a huge concept that needs to be baked into any good information governance program. And I think as a society, we've kind of ignored that. We've put those off and said, okay, that's just a risk, and I'm not really going to analyze it. But the key to your data management is really about maximizing its value up front and minimizing its risk on the back end. The longer you have something, the less valuable it is, and the more risk it becomes, just in terms of quantity and quality.
Yeah. And I think that.
Yeah, go ahead, Amir. Sorry.
Sorry, Candace. Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that's something that it got lost for a long time, and I think the CGOC was out front of that, and I think that organizations are starting to realize that they don't get value out of their data after a certain amount of time, and it's sitting there, and it's a huge risk. It's a risk for litigation. It's a risk for, obviously, all the new regulations and regulations that have frankly been around for a while, but haven't gotten as much attention. And so, the fact that this is kind of coming back around and is now front and center really just shows, CGOC is really on the forefront of a lot of these ideas. And I'm glad that it's getting the attention it does now.
Absolutely. It's funny because I have spent most of my career in information governance really trying to sell people on the concept, and I've recently decided that it's important to try to frame things into perspectives that people understand, and so sort of the bank vault, or really the crown jewel analogy, is one that seems to work. For most things, we have over the last 20, 30 years really focused on protecting our systems. And it's really been about perimeter control and not so much about protecting those crown jewels. And so an analogy that I've used quite frequently, honestly, recently, has been that view of, okay, so let's talk about what our crown jewels are and how do we go about protecting those. And it's like you would any other asset, right? So you need to reduce the cost, you need to increase the value, you need to safeguard them, and you need to insure them. But how do you insure what you don't even know that you have?
Right.
Most security efforts over the last 20, 30 years have really focused on perimeter control, right? So picture you're the person in charge of safeguarding those crown jewels inside the castle, and you've got a whole team of guards and soldiers that have built a giant wall, and they've put razor wire on the wall, and there are people with all sorts of weaponry to protect. But what happens once that person gets inside? Or what if they start inside? I don't know what I have. I can't protect it. It's
right.
like leaving your crown jewels sitting on the coffee table.
Yeah, and you see all the movies and analogies, right? If you had a castle, you have multiple layers of defense, where the most important things, the crown jewels, are 3 or 4 layers back, right? And being able to take
Absolutely.
those out of the courtyard or out off the coffee table, and put them in the right place where they can get the most protection, I think is essential. And so I think that analogy really works well.
Like I said, I probably use that analogy a little too much frequently, but it works for me, and it may have something to do with the fact that I probably read far too many historical epics and things like that. But it does work.
Yeah, you and me both.
but talking about what those things mean and how you go about doing those, the key to anything initially is to assess what you have. It's the Franklin Roosevelt concept of do what you can with what you have where you are. So figure out what you have. And then you honestly have to catalog whatever that is, wherever it is, in whatever format it's in, whether it's, good, bad, or ugly. You catalog it, and then you look for those places where you can remediate risk, and then it's a perpetual cycle of repeat those tasks.
So let's get into what is a catalog, and queued up your next slide. Go for it.
All right. So really, everybody has a catalog of some sort. It just may not be in a format that is accessible or usable. What you need to have in your information asset metadata catalog really is you need to know what information you have, regardless of its form. So whether that's structured or unstructured or semi-structured, whether it's records, it's data in a database, or it's emails that have been stored on someone's PC that actually contain data that the organization needs. You honestly need to be thinking platform independent, and you need to have good glossary and definitions and taxonomies built around that data so that people who need to utilize that information and derive its value can. And then you can build up the valuation on your information assets over time and capture that as well in that catalog so that people can identify and find those things that are truly the most valuable. I was struggling with how to put together some of these slides at one point because there's so much that most organizations have. It just tends to be in a lot of different places or not necessarily written down, but there's information locked in your subject matter's head that you need to capture. The things that you really want to know about your assets and how they're used are know that lineage. Where does that information come in? Where does it live? How is it transformed and used? What applications are using it? What web services are using it? And honestly, this is one of those things that I think that a lot of people tend to overlook, is how's it moving from one system to another, even though it's not necessarily stored within that system. And then ultimately, where does that information go in terms of reports? How long are those reports kept? Who's utilizing them, and how is it being utilized?
Right. So I think if you maybe you might want to back up a slide. I've got a quick question on really, how do you see the differentiation between, data cataloging and data categorization?
To me, categorization is the identification of the type of information that you have. And that type of data is really where you start to identify your policies that apply. Is that data sensitive or not? Does that information have a very specific life cycle that is defined based on risk versus reward? And who should have access to those things? That's also probably where you start to identify valuation, although there's identification of that value at specific data within each category as well, but there's high-level value that you can place there. But all of that should be feeding into that catalog so that it's accessible.
So, not to put words in your mouth, but would you say that basically the categorization really fits into the taxonomy that's in a catalog, and the categorization is actually applying that to the data that's out there across your org?
Absolutely, and that's a perfect way to put that, so that you're defining how to use that at a a macro level within your categorization or taxonomy, or the combination thereof, and then which specific assets that applies to at the micro level. And both of those concepts should live within your catalog.
Right, and then basically the asset usage that you're talking about, does that that kind of fits in with the other concept that we brought up at the top, which is data mapping, right? Which is where do these things exist within your organization for each level of the taxonomy or each category of data? Where do they exist, and as you mentioned, who has access to them, who can get value out of them, et cetera? Is that kind of how you see that data map plugging into the overall structure here?
Absolutely, and honestly, if you try to derive your data mapping doing solely the tasks that have been attempted over the last 15, 20 years by doing subject matter interviews and trying to map all that out by hand using data flows, and I sort of cut my teeth on building data flow diagrams a very long time ago. That documentation is useful, but it's extremely time intensive and utilizes a lot of subject matter expert skill and time as well, and it's not very sustainable. So as each new system is developed or each new web service is written, as an application begins to consume an existing web service, those things are harder and harder to capture over time. Whereas if the data is derived from what you know and then supplemented with that subject matter expert knowledge, you have a much better chance of having a complete vision of that life cycle of the information flowing through your system and that full data map.
Yeah, definitely. I couldn't agree more with that. So I guess the real question is, we've gotten here, we know what a catalog is, we know, what data categorization and how data maps work, hopefully, at least to some degree. The real question is, why do we do this? Why do you think that organizations should have that?
If for absolutely no other reason, it's honestly impossible to do the tasks that we all face today without that. So the questions that you will face are, how do I reduce costs? I need to be able to do process analysis probably in order to do that. And to do that task correctly in today's world, we know that we have all of this information and we're going to analyze that information to figure out, how we could do things better. The current statistic is that 80% of a data scientist's time is spent in finding and curating information. 80%. So if you are able to reduce that by, say, half, how much more productive are your data scientists, which yields to cost reduction as well as potential revenue stream increase, right? So it's finding new uses for data. That's the whole premise behind data science and what we want to do with it. So increase your data scientist productivity. Increase the usage of the data that you have. Help them know what data is valuable and where it is. If you were to face a request to review under one of the current regulations, you must be able to respond to those right to review requests, right to removal, those sorts of things, and you have to know what data exists in your system, what it pertains to, and what all accesses it, and be able to provide that. If there were a security breach, and so you knew as an organization that, system ABC was the one that was attacked and penetrated, what information was in that, what was potentially exposed, and how do you go mitigate that risk? How do you report and comply with regulations regarding privacy for that? All of those concepts are really essential. Additionally, if you are part of litigation and have an eDiscovery request, if without a catalog, you're left with a process that involves pulling in as many subject matter experts as you can, trying to describe the language within the discovery request, and from that point, identify the systems where the information is, and you're quite frankly going to pay an awful lot of money to eDiscovery firms in order to collect and cull that data.
Yeah, and that's, we've always heard historically that the eDiscovery wing has had a blank check because litigation is a cost of doing business. And nobody really looked at hey, can we improve this part of the business? Because it is something that organizations face every day. And I think that, overwhelmingly the answer is yes. There's lots of ways that we can improve the internal workings of litigation response within organizations. And obviously these, data catalogs, data maps, classification or categorization can help with that. So if I was to summarize a little bit of what you said, really it's about time to value and time to or speed of response. So time to value for looking at the analytics workflows within organizations, speed of response when it comes to litigation or regulatory requests, but then also having a defensible process that you can point to. It's repeatable, and so you can say this is what we do every single time. And when you talk about regulation and litigation, that's really essential. And obviously having a repeatable process for analytics and business insights would be a huge win as well. So yeah, I think that all these things they really lead to that time to value and the earlier insights into litigation, into the value of data within your org.
Absolutely, and I think that most of us have a ton of metadata in our organizations. The question is, how do you go about gathering all of that together? What's the process look like, and where do you start? It's honestly, as someone who's approached this as a practitioner, it can be a very overwhelming and daunting task when you look at where you want to be and where you are. My former SVP, who had a military background, used to give me a quote that he had learned in the military, where the question is, what do you do when you find yourself in a hole? And the answer is stop digging. So yes, you can put controls in place on a go-forward basis, and do that so that you don't continue to add to the data without sufficient metadata. But then what do you do with everything that you currently have, and how do you go about that? I think is that thing that looks so overwhelming to all of us to begin with. Right.
So you start by putting a go-forward process in place, and then hopefully don't get overwhelmed by looking at the legacy. And so yeah, so where do you start, I guess, with either side of that?
So we're back to my Teddy Roosevelt quote, which is, do what you can with what you have where you are. And I think most of us, like I said, have a ton of metadata in our organizations. And it's really about identifying what those metadata sources are and pulling them together. So most of us have security monitoring tools of some sort that have metadata you can get from logs that show what data is moving between systems or who has access. Utilize that metadata. You probably have data models. I hope you have data models. As a former data modeler, I would tell you have to have those. But your data models contain a ton of metadata about your structured assets. If you have an enterprise content management system, that has probably classification rules, user access rules. It's got lifecycle information if you've got some sort of records management turned on with that. There's also fantastic tools out there that will do profiling on your structured or your unstructured. And you probably own some bits and or pieces of all of these things in your environment. And it's really about going and gathering whatever metadata you can from those sources and pulling it together. Start there. And then identify what holes you may have, and then go risk rank those. So this is my list of things that I don't really know about in my environment. Okay, which of these probably have the higher risk? You know, and that's a swag. That's a swag. Okay, I know there's probably human information in this system. That's probably higher risk. Let me go there. This one is really, you know, some back-end system that controls our web content management system, but it's really about moving the data from here to here. Probably not as important. So risk rank them and then start remediating.
Yep. And so to you know, kind of cross a couple different idioms here. So, you know, don't boil the ocean. So don't get overwhelmed by you know, what you see out there. And then, as you mentioned earlier, you know, stop digging the hole. So pick the most important things, pick the riskiest things, and start, you know, cataloging and categorizing there, right? Figure out, you know, where that risk exists and start doing something about it.
Absolutely. And, you know, I'm a big person for starting with the people in the process. And I think that's important, that when I say catalog, I don't mean that you, before you do anything else, you go out and buy a big information catalog. Although I will say that you will reach a point in this journey where it's an absolute necessity to probably buy one of those enterprise class information governance catalogs. And I could recommend one for you if you want to have a conversation later on about that. But that's not where you need to start. So you can start with spreadsheets and maybe a SharePoint site or something like that, just a place to gather all that data. It's important to do that. And in that process, you will start to figure out what's more important and more valuable versus what's not. But you've got to also empower your people resources to march forward with this. So involve the subject matter experts wherever they are, whether those are your cybersecurity professionals or your application developers, or they're the business process people who work with your highly valuable records. You know, get those people involved in this process and in helping you identify and maintain the metadata. Additionally, ensure that you are walking alongside and constantly including those downstream consumers of this resource that you're creating. So your data scientists, your business intelligence teams, your application developers, again, so that those people understand that this is a resource you're building out. They'll help contribute to its content, but they'll also be able to reap the rewards of it. And then, like I said, at a certain point, you really are going to hit a wall where the bubblegum and Band-Aids are becoming too large and unwieldy to manage. And if you're doing this well, it doesn't take long to get there, I will say. And at that point, really, you need to look to technology that will really sort of automate some of those integrations of those metadata sources. But like I said, that's not your first step. Your first step is really just to go figure out what you have and where it is, and then identify what you can do with it and tie it all together.
Okay, let's actually take a little bit of a detour here, and so when we're getting started, how do we or how did you make the business case to your business for actually going and undertaking something like this?
So that's probably a long story, and it's been several years in the making. But really, the biggest thing that I had to do in order to make the business case was to actually define all of the different business cases that are out there for this. I'm an information governance professional, right? That's what I do. I look to manage risk, which overall, for the most part, sounds like selling an insurance policy, which is just not all that fun and exciting. So it's hard to sell those concepts to business people who are looking to drive new revenue. But if you look at the various stakeholders within your organization and look to including all of them in this process and process, it makes it a more easily digestible concept. So,
right.
From a privacy perspective, in order to comply with GDPR or CCPA or TIPIDA, I'm honestly not sure how, without a catalog, you could respond to that. So looking at, GDPR is 4% of gross global revenue. That's there's a big target. I have yet to figure out how to quantify the CCPA risk because it seems to be written for class action litigation. But you can show these are potential costs. Additionally, reduction in eDiscovery is absolutely a benefit that you can quantify or at least make a swag at. So take your most recent litigation, identify how much time was spent in collecting and culling data to provide for review, and show that, swag a partial reduction in that. And like I said, go back to your data science team and go for a low number, right? If 80% of your data scientist time is spent in finding and curating data, then, plan to reduce 20% of that to make them more productive. And so once you start putting all of the various pieces in place and say, these are the benefits, what all it might impact, it's an easier business case to make. It's still
right.
probably sell for a single sort of point in time project, but the longer term scope is an easier sell by just continually pointing out all of the stakeholders.
Right, and that was going to be my next question is, if we take another tack at making a business case, it can be like, let's look at people who have done this and been successful. And so I was going to ask, how do you assess the value or the benefits of the program that you've put in place? And here's your answer, I guess, right?
So honestly, we are, and I was actually having a conversation yesterday with one of our information architecture managers about, okay, so what metrics do we want to put in place to start showing that value? Because like I said, an awful lot of it kind of feels like an insurance policy at times. But I've identified and categorized this data as this type of data. Therefore, I've applied my retention policy, and through that retention policy, I have eliminated, 420 gigs of data in the last 6 months, while at a potential cost of $18,000 per gig. for eDiscovery, that's a potential cost reduction of this amount. And track everything. Even if it seems obvious, you track it anyway. And then you can start showing, okay, this is the actualized reward, and this is the potential cost reward that we've avoided here. And I honestly haven't even figured out what all those metrics might be for my organization, but I will keep working at that.
Right. And so, yeah, one of the things that I've always seen is, once we've kind of deployed this or had, implemented solutions at customers is that once you have that sort of understanding, people start coming out of the woodworks, understanding of your data, people start coming out of the woodworks and wanting to utilize it. So, if you started with a regulatory response, all of a sudden your litigation team is like, hey, I could utilize that. Or if you have a divestiture or a merger or, a data center project or, business analytics, et cetera, there's all sorts of uses for it. And part of the problem that I've seen is that organizations are siloed. And so the burden of a program like this or, the tooling behind it might have to start with one part of the organization. And then, all sorts of parts of the organization would then get to leverage it down the road. But up front, that doesn't make putting a plan in place any easier. And I think that you at J.B. Hunt are one of the customers that I've seen that has really been able to put a company-wide plan in place that can be leveraged by all different parts. And so, did you guys have silos to begin with, and were you able to overcome those, or was there some other inner workings that made it a little bit different or easier or more challenging for you?
Yes. Yes, we had silos, and yes, we had challenges. Like I said before, there is an awful lot of metadata knowledge that exists sort of within specific stakeholders in specific areas, and pulling that information together and getting those individual stakeholders, getting their time is difficult. But it's fairly easy once you start working through a pilot and show the return for an individual litigation matter or an individual regulation or an audit response, whatever that is, because you really can eliminate a burden that exists on most of those subject matter experts. It's not good for any organization to have to rely on a number of heads that contain all of the information. And so getting those people on board is certainly helpful. And I will say that I actually put on this slide as the last bullet, passionate, persistent. I have been accused by a former SVP of mine of being passionately persistent about information governance and the need for a catalog. He actually threatened to buy me a T-shirt at one point that said, "Please give me a catalog." And I said, "That sounds great. I'll wear it, but you have to buy me the catalog first." It does. Your role as a information governess, in my case, is to be that champion and just continually say, this is a problem that I've solved by my efforts in information governance and cataloging. This is a problem that I could have solved much more quickly and less painfully had I had this, and just continuing to show where that value is up until the point that you've built this nirvana program that I'm hoping to get to at some point. But all along the while, showing every win, whether it's small or large, show those wins and keep showing them to continue to build that business case, to continue to build the investment, and to grow out that metadata. It's vitally important to the success.
Right. So reminding people where you were and where you are now on a regular basis, right? And then and showing the value to different stakeholders. So obviously, different people get value of different things, and so being able to highlight all of those is really essential.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So there's my paranoia slide. I know where your data is. Do you?
Is this the post catalog sweater or T-shirt that they gave you?
I don't have it yet, but this is the one I designed that I want.
Fair enough. Fair enough. All right. So any kind of last minute thoughts or comments before we go to Q&A?
I did want to highlight that included in the presentation are some recommended resources, specifically the CGOC's maturity model. I think that's a great place to start. It's somewhat daunting and overwhelming the first time you go through one of those maturity assessments. And if you happen to be a typically pessimistic person like I am, then you tend to find yourself figuring out if there's a negative response to things. But it's a good tool to use to identify where you are. Do what you can with what you have where you are. You got to start with where you are. And then you can check out the other resources that are listed here. And then I guess Q&A it is.
Yeah, no, I'd like to reiterate the highlights of, obviously the maturity model is essential, but also you'll notice the second item on your screen right now, the 4 easy ways to get started with information governance. That's a paper that Candace helped put together, and I think that's a great read, and I'd highly recommend that to the audience as well. With that, yes, we do have some questions from the audience. So I guess without any further ado, let me jump right into them. The first one that came in was, let's see, have you had to deal with shadow IT? And Candace, I'm sure you have. And if so, how do you control it, or more importantly, bring it into policy?
So sure, I don't know of a single organization where there's not some form of shadow IT. We have, through everything that we've done in information technology over the last 25 years, we've talked about enabling citizen data scientists and giving people more desktop productivity tools and things like that. And it's really about involving those people and what they're doing in the process. So it's more that start with what you have. So work with individuals within those sorts of roles to help them become champions for what you're providing. Those people are most likely producing reports, doing analytics. You're able to provide them with a way to best get to the data that's valuable. So if you get them involved in that, then they can ultimately consume that as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. So we also talked a little bit about all the different people that get value out of an information governance program like this. But the question that came in was where does the budget for information governance projects usually come from?
I think that's a variable question dependent on your organization. So I will say that most information governance programs have historically gotten funding from data management, and it really all seemed to start with a storage management play. Because once upon a time, storage was expensive. Storage is no longer expensive. It's more, cost really is in processing and analytics now. And so funding now is subdivided. So legal should be paying for part within your organization, whether that's the direct cost allocation or however that works within your org, because it's definitely a compliance play in order to avoid regulation, sanctions, those sorts of things.
Right.
But your analytics organization pays for part of that, and security for sure, because you're definitely helping to reduce security costs as well.
Yeah. So extending beyond the silos to a certain degree, right, and trying to kind of spread the costs around based on who will get value out of a program like this.
Absolutely.
So next question, and it was about subject matter experts. So did you, when you started, I guess, did you have enough subject matter experts in your organization? And most likely, if not, how did you get them up to speed? How did you supplement the knowledge needed?
So the answer is there are never enough subject matter experts. And the ones that you have are probably already filling that subject matter expert role for a number of different projects and are very time limited. I think the key is to involve those subject matter experts early. Help them to understand what you're driving towards, but then ask for their input for where else we might go for that metadata. So let them identify what metadata sources they have and try to build out whatever means you can to gather as much information as possible beforehand and present it to those stakeholders or SMEs as a review tactic rather than through the traditional interview method. Those people honestly just don't have time for lengthy interviews.
Right. And so it looks like
they're probably wearing 4 other hats.
It looks like a follow-up question here. So if we don't have any real, subject matter experts, unless we hire a consultant, you're not, how do you do it yourself? Any quick start advice on getting started with something like this and ramping up a program?
Well, I think that the get started key is start with figuring out where you are, right? So use a maturity model. Do a risk assessment on your system. You should have a catalog of some sort of what your applications are. And just list them out and pull somebody in from your information management group and your records management group and have them take a guess at, okay, which of these are likely the most valuable and which ones are likely the highest risk, and go start diving into them. Like I said, you probably own a number of tools that came with some other tool to help you in this. You probably have at least one data profiler. It may not be a large scale one, but you probably have something. Utilize that and go figure out what's there and just start building it out. And try to take a slice at a time and continue to grow with it.
Right.
And then continually reassess your maturity along that. And there are a number of steps and tips that you'll find, like the CGOC sort of get started process is there. That simple blog that I put together has some steps on how you can go about doing things. There's a lot of information out there. Don't get overwhelmed. Just figure out where you are and start marching forward.
All right.
Don't keep digging.
And so one last question in the along that line of don't keep digging. Let's do one more, and then try to get ourselves out of the hole, right? So how would you judge the success of an information governance program? So we talked a little bit about all the taking all the little wins and making sure those are kind of noticed by the organization. But holistically, how do you judge your success overall?
So one thing is do track all of those little wins and keep that running list. But there will be some more obvious large-scale wins, and those need to be pretty much shouted from the rooftop. But then do a continual self-assessment using a maturity model where you say, okay, we started off here. At this point, we're here. And these are the things that got us there. And identify what those next steps are, and then measure and track to that. And so it's continual improvement processes that you do in any process, whether that's in manufacturing or in information governance, and report your own success repeatedly. You have to be your own champion and your own cheerleader, and wear your T-shirt that says "I know where your data is" to you.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to leave us on. So we'll wrap up here. I guess I just want to express my heartfelt thanks, Candace, for doing this with us today. Every conversation I have with you is interesting, and I always learn something. So this has been great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this.
Yeah, me too. And now I guess I'm going to turn it back over to Katie. Katie?
All right. Thank you so much for a very informative session. Again, everyone, our speakers today were Amir Jaibaji and Candace McCabe. And I'd like to give a special thanks to IBM for making this webcast possible. This webcast has been recorded and will be available later today to Compliance Week subscribers on our website under the Webcast tab, which also contains a library of additional CPE webcasts. If you would like to learn more about subscribing, please contact us at info@complianceweek.com. Once again, to obtain your CPE certificate, please disable your pop-up blockers in order to access the exam. The webcast will close automatically, and the final examination will be presented in a separate window. If you have trouble viewing the CPE test or receiving the CPE certificate, please send an email to info@complianceweek.com. This concludes our webcast, and thank you again for joining us. And goodbye.